যদি সবাই ফিরে যায়, ওরে ওরে ও ভাগা সবাই ফিরে যায়, যদি গহন পথে যাওয়ার কালে কেউ ফিরে না যায়, তবে পথের কাটা তুই রক্ত মাখা চরণ তলে একলা দলরে, তুই রক্ত মাখা চরণ তলে একলা দলরে, যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে, তবে একলা চলো রে। যদি আলো না ধরে, ওরে ওরে ও ভাগা আলো না ধরে, যদি ঝড় বাদলে আধার রাতে দুয়ার দেয় ঘরে, তবে বজ্রানলে আপন বুকের পাঁজর জ্বালিয়ে নিয়ে একলা চলো রে, আপন বুকের পাঁজর জ্বালিয়ে নিয়ে একলা চলো রে, যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে, তবে একলা চলো রে। একলা চলো, একলা চলো, একলা চলো, একলা চলো রে।
Hi guys, thank you for joining the live stream. The audio is coming fine. Yeah. Okay. What a disappointing last live stream. I still haven't recovered from that disappointment. I don't know if it's because I slept too less because I had to wake up early and go to High Court, or is it because of the degree of disappointment? I called up Academic Man about it as well. He was not that surprised. He said that, yeah, that's kind of what Surinder Jotka also does. But at least they're acknowledging the reality of caste. That's the most joy we can get out of this. That at least they are understanding caste properly. Hi Netizen, hi AP, hi Neon. Okay. Now we start. We resume our discussion of the new book I got as a gift from my mom. Enlightenment Now by Steven Pinker. We've completed part 1, discussing part 1 last day. Today we start part 2. Part 1 was called Enlightenment. Part 2 is called Progress. It starts with a quote from Obama in 2016. He says, if you had to choose a moment in history to be born and you did not know ahead of time who you would be, you didn't know whether you were going to be born into a wealthy family or a poor family, what country you'd be born in, whether you were going to be a man or a woman. If you had to choose blindly what moment you would want to be born, you would choose now. Yeah, very true. Unfortunately, his policies do not reflect this thought process. Now we start chapter 4. Chapter 4 starts from part 2. This is called Progressophobia. Yes, I'm sure a lot of our AC temperaturists will agree with this. Are there any thoughts on Bengal election 2026? Yes, best case scenario 110. That's the best case scenario, so which probably means they won't get BJP won't get that many and they'll lose in the end. Intellectuals hate progress. That's the first line of this chapter, lol. This is going to be fun. Intellectuals who call themselves progressive really hate progress. It's not that they hate the fruits of progress, mind you. Most pundits, critics, and their readers use computers rather than quills and inkwells, and they prefer to have their surgery with anesthesia rather than without it. It's the idea. By the way, do you all know, any medical students might know, how did they manage before anesthesia? At one point, there was a custom of, at least in England, I've heard of, just hiring a boxer who'd be found on the streets looking to book a fight. People would have to bet on him and stuff. That guy would be brought in. He would knock someone down, essentially. He would knock out the patient. They would faint, and that's when the surgery would be completed. Lol. It's the idea of progress that rankles the chattering class. The Enlightenment belief that by understanding the world, we can improve the human condition. An entire lexicon of abuse has grown up to express their scorn. If you think knowledge can help solve problems, then you have a quote unquote blind faith and a quasi religious belief in the quote unquote outmoded superstition and false promise of the quote unquote myth of the quote unquote onward march of quote unquote inevitable progress. You are a quote unquote cheerleader for quote unquote vulgar American can doism with the rara spirit of boardroom ideology, quote unquote boardroom ideology, Silicon Valley, and the quote unquote Chamber of Commerce. You're a practitioner of Whig history, a naive optimist, a Pollyanna, and of course, a Pangloss, a modern day version of the philosopher in Voltaire's Candide, who asserts that all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. Professor Pangloss, as it happens, is what we would now call a pessimist. A modern optimist believes that the world can be much, much better than it is today. Voltaire was satirizing not the Enlightenment hope for progress, but its opposite, the religious rationalization for suffering called theodicy, also asceticism, austerity, according to which God had no chance but to allow epidemics and massacres because a world without them is metaphysically impossible. Epithets aside, the idea that the world is better than it was and can get better still fell out of fashion among the clerici long ago. In The Idea of Decline in Western History, Arthur Herman shows that prophets of doom are the all-stars of the liberal arts curriculum, including Nietzsche, Arthur Schopenhauer, Martin Heidegger, Theodor Adorno, Walter Benjamin, Herbert Marcuse, Jean-Paul Sartre, Frantz Fanon, Michel Foucault, Edward Said, Cornel West, and a chorus of eco-pessimists. Surveying the intellectual landscape at the end of the 20th century, Herman lamented a quote-unquote grand recessional of the luminous exponents of Enlightenment humanism, the ones who believe that since people generate conflicts and problems in society, they can also resolve them. In History of the Idea of Progress, the sociologist Robert Nisbet agreed, quote, the skepticism regarding Western progress that was once confined to a very small number of intellectuals in the 19th century has grown and spread to not merely the large majority of intellectuals in this final quarter of the century, but to many millions of other people in the West, including somehow some Indians who are only now seeing some fruits of progress and they are already hating it. Yes, it's not just those who intellectualize for a living who think it's not just those who intellectualize for a living who think the world is going to hell in a handcart. It's ordinary people when they switch into intellectualizing mode. Yeah, we know who he's talking about. Psychologists have long known that people tend to see their own lives through rose-colored glasses. They think they are less likely than the average person to become the victim of a divorce, layoff, accident, illness, or crime. But change the question from the people's lives to their society, and they transform from Pollyanna to Eeyore. Eeyore. Public opinion researchers call it the optimism gap. For more than 2 decades, through good times and bad, when Europeans were asked by pollsters whether their own economic situation would get better or worse in the coming year, more of them said it would get better, but when they were asked about their country's economic situation, more of them said it would get worse. A large majority of Britons think that immigration, teen pregnancy, litter, unemployment, crime, vandalism, and drugs are a problem in the United Kingdom as a whole, while few think they are problems in their area. Environmental quality, too, is judged in most nations to be worse in the nation than in the community, and worse in the world than in the nation. In almost every year from 1992 through 2015, an era in which the rate of violent crime plummeted, a majority of Americans told pollsters that crime was rising. In late 2015, large majorities in 11 developed countries said that the world is getting worse. And in most of the last 40 years, a solid majority of Americans have said that the country is, quote unquote, heading in the wrong direction, even though most people will die of obesity before climate change kills them. Are they right? Is pessimism correct? Could the state of the world, like the stripes on a barbershop pole, keep sinking lower and lower? It's easy to see why people feel that way. Every day, the news is filled with stories about war, terrorism, crime, pollution, inequality, drug abuse, and oppression. And it's not just the headlines we are talking about, it's the op-eds and long-form stories as well. Magazine covers, warn us of coming anarchies, plagues, epidemics, collapses, and so many crises: farm, health, retirement, welfare, energy deficit, that copywriters have had to escalate to the redundant, quote unquote, serious crisis. It's not just crisis, it's serious crisis now. Whether or not the world really is getting worse, the nature of news will interact with the nature of cognition to make us think that it is. News is about things that happen, not things that don't happen. We never see a journalist saying to the camera, I'm reporting live from a country where a war has not broken out, or a city that has not been bombed, or a school that has not been shot up. As long as bad things have not vanished from the face of the earth, there will always be enough incidents to fill the news, especially when billions of smartphones turn most of the world's population into crime reporters and war correspondents. And among the things that do happen, the positive and negative ones unfold on different timelines. The news, far from being a first draft of history, is closer to play by play sports commentary. It focuses on discrete events, generally those that took place since the last edition, in earlier times, the day before, now, seconds before. Bad things can happen quickly, but good things aren't built in a day, and as they unfold, they will be out of sync with the news cycle. The peace researcher Johan Johan Galtung pointed out that if a newspaper came out once every 50 years, it would not report half a century of celebrity gossip and political scandals. It would report momentous global changes such as the increase in life expectancy. The nature of news is likely to distort people's view of the world because of a mental bug that the psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman called the availability heuristic, which is people estimate the probability of an event or the frequency of a kind of thing by the ease with which instances come to mind. In many walks of life, this is a serviceable rule of thumb. Frequent events leave stronger memory traces, so stronger memories generally indicate more frequent events. Like you really are on solid ground in guessing that pigeons are more common in cities than orioles, even though you are drawing on your memory of encountering them rather than on a bird census. But whenever a memory turns up high in the result list of the mind's search engine for reasons other than frequency, because it is recent, vivid, gory, distinctive, or upsetting, people will overestimate how likely it is in the world, which are more numerous in the English language. Words that begin with K or words with K in the third position. Most people say the former. Words that begin with K or words with K in the third position. Most people say the former. In fact, there are 3 times as many words with K in the third position: ankle, ask, awkward, bake, cake, make, take. But we retrieve words by their initial sounds, so keep, kind, kill, kid, and king are likelier to pop into mind on demand. Availability errors are a common source of folly in human reasoning. First year medical students interpret every rash as a symptom of an exotic disease. And vacationers stay out of the water after they have read about a shark attack, or if they have just seen Jaws. Plane crashes always make the news, but car crashes, which kill far more people, almost never do. Not surprisingly, of course, car crashes kill way more people than gun violence and stray dog attacks, and nobody wants to ban drivers or cars. Not surprisingly, many people have a fear of flying, but almost no one has a fear of driving. People rank tornadoes, which kill about 50 Americans a year, as a more common cause of death than asthma, which kills more than 4,000 Americans a year, presumably because tornadoes make for better television. It's easy to see how the availability heuristic, stoked by the news policy of if it bleeds, it leads. If there's blood in the story, then it has to be a leading story. This could induce a sense of gloom about the state of the world. Media scholars who tally news stories of different kinds or present editors with a menu of possible stories and see which they pick and how they display them have confirmed that gatekeepers prefer negative to positive coverage, holding the events constant. That in turn provides an easy formula for pessimists on the editorial page, which is make a list of all the wrong things that are happening anywhere on the planet that week, and you have an impressive sounding case that civilization has never faced greater peril. The consequences of, I have to underline this by the way. The availability heuristic. The consequences of negative news are themselves negative. Far from being better informed, heavy news watchers can become miscalibrated. They worry more about crime, even when rates are falling, and sometimes they part company with reality altogether. A 2016 poll found that a large majority of Americans follow news about ISIS closely, and 77% agree that Islamic militants operating in Syria and Iraq pose a serious threat to the existence or survival of the United States, a belief that is nothing short of delusional. Consumers of negative news, not surprisingly, become glum. A recent literature review cited misperception of risk, anxiety, lower mood levels, learned helplessness, contempt and hostility towards others, desensitization, and in some cases, complete avoidance of the news. And they become fatalistic, saying things like, "Why should I vote? It's not going to help." Or, "I could donate money, but there's just going to be another kid who's starving the next week." Seeing how journalistic habits and cognitive biases bring out the worst in each other, how can we soundly appraise the state of the world? The answer is to count. How many people are victims of violence as a proportion of the number of people alive? How many are sick? How many starving? How many poor? How many oppressed? How many illiterate? How many unhappy? And are those numbers going up or down? A quantitative mindset, despite its nerdy aura, is in fact the morally enlightened one, because it treats every human life as having equal value rather than privileging the people who are closest to us or most photogenic. And it holds out the hope that we might identify the causes of suffering and thereby know which measures are most likely to reduce it. Abhay is saying higher divorce rates, family breakdowns. Yes, because we are going through a churn in how we see each gender and marriage in general. So, again, if we don't zoom in to the years between 2015 and 2025 and zoom out and maybe have a news report about divorce marriage every 30, 40 years, 50 years, then there won't be any news about these things, because society will have adjusted to these changes, and we will only talk about how we are about to settle on Mars any day now. So similarly, if we are talking about numbers, some divorces definitely are necessary. Wouldn't you say so, Abhay? The bad marriages, abusive marriages, people sticking together just because of social stigma or or fear, or for the kids and stuff, whose direct side effect is therefore everybody, almost, well, let's say a lot of people these days think that any fight is a reason for a divorce, or like in the USA, where it's incentivized to divorce your husband because you get benefits of a social program. So therefore we have to look at it just another problem right now, not a trajectory of decline. That was the goal of my 2011 book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which presented 100 graphs and maps showing how violence and the conditions that foster it have declined over the course of history. To emphasize that the declines took place at different times and had different causes, I gave them names. The pacification process was a five-fold reduction in the rate of death from tribal raiding and feuding, the consequence of effective states exerting control over a territory. The civilizing process was a 40-fold reduction in homicide and other violent crimes. These are the names he gave, okay? Pacification process, civilizing process, etc. So the civilizing process was a 40-fold reduction, 40 times reduction in homicide and other violent crimes, which followed upon the entrenchment of the rule of law and norms of self-control in early modern Europe. The humanitarian revolution is another name for the Enlightenment era abolition of slavery, religious persecution, and cruel punishments. The long peace is the historian's term for the decline of great power and interstate war after World War II. Following the end of the Cold War, the world has enjoyed a new peace with fewer civil wars, genocides, and autocracies. And since the 1950s, the world has been swept by a cascade of rights revolutions: civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, children's rights, and animal rights. Few of these declines are contested among experts who are familiar with the numbers. Historical criminologists, for example, agree that homicide plummeted after the Middle Ages, and it's a commonplace. It's a commonplace among international relations scholars that major wars tapered off after 1945, but they come as a surprise to most people in the wider world. I had thought that a parade of graphs with time on the horizontal axis, body counts, or other measures of violence on the vertical axis, and a line that meandered from the top left to the bottom right would cure audiences of the availability bias and persuade them that at least in this sphere of well-being, the world has made progress. But I learned from their questions and objections that resistance to the idea of progress runs deeper than statistical fallacies. Of course, any data set is an imperfect reflection of reality, so it is legitimate to question how accurate and representative the numbers truly are. But the objections revealed not just a skepticism about the data, but also an unpreparedness for the possibility that the human condition has improved. Many people lack the conceptual tools to ascertain whether progress has taken place or not. The very idea that things can get better just doesn't compute for some people. Here are stylized versions of dialogues I have often had with questioners. They say, quote, "So violence has declined linearly since the beginning of history. Awesome." End quote. No, not linearly. It would be astonishing if any measure of human behavior with all its vicissitudes tick downwards by a constant amount per unit of time, decade after decade and century after century, and not monotonically either, uh, which is probably what the questioners have in mind. That would mean that it always decreased or stayed the same, never increased. Real historical curves have wiggles, upticks, spikes, and sometimes sickening lurches, like the stock market essentially. It's always like this, there's no straight line. Real historical curves have wiggles, upticks, spikes, and sometimes sickening lurches. Examples include the two world wars, a boom in crime in Western countries from the mid 1960s to the early 1990s, and a bulge of civil wars in the developing world following decolonization in the 1960s and 1970s. Progress consists of trends in violence on which these fluctuations are superimposed, a downward swoop or drift, a return from a temporary swelling to a low baseline. Progress cannot always be monotonic because solutions to problems create new problems, Abhay. But progress can resume when the new problems are solved in their turn. By the way, the non monotonicity of social data provides an easy formula for news outlets to accentuate the negative. If you ignore all the years in which an indicator of some problem declines and report every uptick, since after all it's quote unquote news, readers will come away with the impression that life is getting worse and worse even as it gets better and better. In the first 6 months of 2016, the New York Times pulled this trick 3 times with figures for suicide, longevity, and automobile fatalities. Well, if levels of violence don't always go down, that means they are cyclical. So even if they are low right now, it's only a matter of time before they go back up. No. Changes over time may be statistical, with unpredictable fluctuations, without being cyclical, namely, oscillating like a pendulum between two extremes. That is, even if a reversal is possible at any time, that does not mean it becomes more likely as time passes. Many invest unless you believe in Judgment Day. Many investors have lost their shirts betting on a misnamed business, quote unquote, business cycle that in fact consists of unpredictable swings. Progress can take place when the reversals in a positive trend become less frequent, become less severe, or in some cases, cease altogether. How can you say that violence has decreased? Didn't you read about the school shooting or terrorist bombing or artillery shelling or soccer riot or barroom stabbing in the news this morning? A decline is not the same thing as a disappearance. The statement X is greater than Y is different from the statement Y is equal to O or Y is equal to 0. Yeah, Y is equal to 0. Something can decrease a lot without vanishing altogether. That means that the level of violence today is completely irrelevant to the question of whether violence has declined over the course of history. The only way to answer that question is to compare the level of violence now with the level of violence in the past. And whenever you look at the level of violence in the past, you find a lot of it, even if it isn't as fresh in memory as the morning's headlines. All your fancy statistics about violence going down don't mean anything if you are one of the victims. True, but they do mean that you are less likely to be a victim. For that reason, they mean the world to the millions of people who are not victims but would have been if rates of violence had stayed the same. So you are saying that we can all sit back and relax, that violence will just take care of itself. Illogical, Captain. If you see that a pile of laundry has gone down, it does not mean the clothes washed themselves. It means someone washed the clothes. If a type of violence has gone down, then some change in the social, cultural, or material milieu has caused it to go down. If the conditions persist, violence could remain low or decline even further. If they don't, it won't. That makes it important to find out what the causes are, so we can try to intensify them and apply them more widely to ensure that the decline of violence continues. To say that violence has gone down is to be naive, sentimental, idealistic, romantic, starry-eyed, Whiggish, utopian, a Pollyanna, a Pangloss. No. To look at data showing that violence has gone down and say violence has gone down is to describe a fact. To look at data showing that violence has gone down and say violence has gone up is to be delusional. To ignore data on violence and say violence has gone up is to be a know nothing. As for accusations of romanticism, I can reply with some confidence. I am also the author of the staunchly unromantic, anti utopian, The Blank Slate, The Modern Denial of Human Nature, in which I argued that human beings are fitted by evolution with a number of destructive motives, such as greed, lust, dominance, vengeance, and self deception. But I believe that people are also fitted with a sense of sympathy, an ability to reflect on their predicament, and faculties to think up and share new ideas, the better angels of our nature, in the words of Abraham Lincoln. Only by looking at the facts can we tell to what extent our better angels have prevailed over our inner demons at a given time and place. How can you predict that violence will keep going down? Your theory could be refuted by a war breaking out tomorrow. A statement that some measure of violence has gone down is not a theory but an observation of a fact. And yes, the fact that a measure has changed over time is not the same as a prediction that it will continue to change in that way at all times forever. As the investment ads are required to say, past performance is no guarantee of future results. In that case, what good are all those graphs and analysis? Isn't a scientific theory supposed to make testable predictions? A scientific theory makes predictions in experiments in which the causal influences are controlled. No theory can make a prediction about the world at large, with its 7 billion people spreading viral ideas in global networks and interacting with chaotic cycles of weather and resources. To declare what the future holds in an uncontrollable world, and without an explanation of why events unfold as they do, is not prediction but prophecy. And as David Deutsch observes, quote, the most important of all limitations on knowledge creation is that we cannot prophesy. We cannot predict the content of ideas yet to be created or their effects. This limitation is not only consistent with the unlimited growth of knowledge, it is entailed by it. Unlimited growth of knowledge entails acknowledging this limitation, essentially, that you won't be able to prophesize. Our inability to prophesy is not, of course, a license to ignore the facts. An improvement in some measure of human well-being suggests that overall more things have pushed in the right direction than in the wrong direction. Whether we should expect progress to continue depends on whether we know what those forces are and how long they will remain in place. That will vary from trend to trend. Some may turn out to be like Moore's law, the number of transistors per computer chip doubles every 2 years, and give grounds of confidence, though not certainty, that the fruits of human ingenuity will accumulate and progress will continue. Some may be like the stock market and foretell short-term fluctuations but long-term gains. Some of these may reel in a statistical distribution with a quote-unquote thick tail, in which extreme events, even if less likely, cannot be ruled out. Still others may be cyclical or chaotic. In chapters 19 and 21, we will examine rational forecasting in an uncertain world. For now, we should keep in mind that a positive trend suggests, but does not prove, that we have been doing something right, and that we should seek to identify what it is and do more of it. When all these objections are exhausted, I often see people racking their brains to find some way in which the news cannot be as good as the data suggest. In desperation, they turn to semantics. Isn't internet trolling a form of violence? Isn't strip mining a form of violence? Isn't inequality a form of violence? Isn't pollution a form of violence? Isn't poverty a form of violence? Isn't consumerism a form of violence? Isn't divorce a form of violence? Isn't advertising a form of violence? Isn't keeping statistics on violence a form of violence? As wonderful as metaphor is as a rhetorical device, it is a poor way to assess the state of humanity. Moral reasoning requires proportionality. It may be upsetting when someone says mean things on Twitter, but it is not the same as the slave trade or the Holocaust. It also requires distinguishing rhetoric from reality. Marching into a rape crisis center and demanding to know what they have done about the rape of the environment does nothing for rape victims and nothing for the environment. Finally, improving the world requires an understanding of cause and effect. Though primitive moral intuitions tend to lump, this is why people like Suraj Yangre need to be counted on this specific argument, that the condition of lower castes in India was similar to that of Jews during Holocaust, essentially, because he's saying, or people like him usually say that it was pure Nazism and Hitler type of oppression going on by upper castes, especially Brahmins, towards the lower castes. So go to a Jew and say, yes, lower caste oppression in India was the same as Holocaust. See what happens to your funding. Yeah, good point, Shayok. Only a fool would call Islamic India progress from pre-Islamic India. Yes, that was one era. In the end, today we are better than pre-Islamic India. Therefore, his point holds. And besides, he's not talking about one country, the world in general. Finally, improving the world requires an understanding of cause and effect. Though primitive moral intuitions tend to lump bad things together and find a villain to blame them on, there is no coherent phenomenon of quote unquote bad things that we can seek to understand and eliminate. Entropy and evolution will generate them in profusion. War, crime, pollution, poverty, disease, and incivility are evils that may have little in common. And if we want to reduce them, we can't play word games that make it impossible even to discuss them individually. I have run through these objections to prepare the way for my presentation of other measures of human progress. The incredulous reaction to Better Angels, his book Better Angels, convinced me that it isn't just the availability heuristic that makes people fatalistic about progress. Nor can the media's fondness for bad news be blamed entirely on a cynical chase for eyeballs and clicks. No, the psychological roots of progressophobia run deeper. The deepest is a bias that has been summarized in the slogan, "Bad is stronger than good." The idea can be captured in a set of thought experiments suggested by Tversky. How much better can you imagine yourself feeling than you are feeling right now? How much worse can you imagine yourself feeling? In answering the first hypothetical, most of us can imagine a bit more of a spring in our step or a twinkle in our eye. But the answer to the second one is, it's bottomless. This asymmetry in mood can be explained by an asymmetry in life, a corollary of the law of entropy. How many things could happen to you today that would leave you much better off? How many things could happen that would leave you much worse off? Once again, to answer the first question, we can all come up with the odd windfall or stroke of good luck, but the answer to the second one is, it's endless. But we need not rely on our imaginations. The psychological literature confirms that people dread losses more than they look forward to gains, that they dwell on setbacks more than they savor good fortune, and that they are more stung by criticism than they are heartened by praise. As a psycholinguist, I am compelled to add that the English language has far more words for negative emotions than for positive ones. One exception to the negativity bias is found in autobiographical memory. Though we tend to remember bad events as well as we remember good ones, the negative coloring of the misfortunes fades with time, particularly the ones that happen to us. We are wired for nostalgia. In human memory, time heals most wounds. Two other illusions mislead us into thinking that things aren't what they used to be. We mistake the growing burdens of maturity and parenthood for a less innocent world, and we mistake a decline in our own faculties for a decline in the times. As the columnist Franklin Pierce Adams pointed out, nothing is more responsible for the good old days than a bad memory. Intellectual culture should strive to counteract our cognitive biases, but all too often it reinforces them. The cure for the availability bias is quantitative thinking, but the literary scholar Steve Connor has noted that there is in the arts and humanities an exceptionless consensus about the encroaching horror of the domain of number. This quote unquote ideological rather than accidental innumeracy leads writers to notice, for example, that wars take place today and wars took place in the past, and to conclude that nothing has changed, failing to acknowledge the difference between an era with a handful of wars that collectively kill in the thousands and an era with dozens of wars that collectively killed in the millions. And it leaves them unappreciative of systemic processes that eke out incremental improvements over the long term. Nor is intellectual culture equipped to treat the negativity bias. Indeed, our vigilance for bad things around us opens up a market for professional curmudgeons who call our attention to bad things we may have missed. Experiments have shown that a critic who pans a book is perceived as more competent than a critic who praises it. And the same may be true of critics of society. Always predict the worst and you will be hailed as a prophet. The musical humorist Tom Lehrer once advised. At least since the time of the Hebrew prophets, who blended their social criticism of forewarnings of disaster, pessimism has been equated with, who blended their social criticism with forewarnings of disaster, pessimism has been equated with moral seriousness. अगर तुम बोलोगे कुछ खराब होने वाला है, then you are a more serious person. Journalists believe that by accentuating the negative, they are discharging their duty as watchdogs, muckrakers, whistleblowers, and afflictors of the comfortable. And intellectuals know they can attain instant gravitas by pointing to an unsolved problem and theorizing that it is a symptom of a sick society. The converse is true as well. The financial writer Morgan Housel has observed that while pessimists sound like they are trying to help you, optimists sound like they're trying to sell you something. Whenever someone offers a solution to a problem, critics will be quick to point out that it is not a panacea, a silver bullet, a magic bullet, or a one-size-fits-all solution. It's just a band-aid or a quick technological fix that fails to get at the root causes and will blow back with side effects and unintended consequences. Of course, since nothing is a panacea and everything has side effects, you can't just do one thing. You can't do just one thing. These common tropes are little more than a refusal to entertain the possibility that anything can ever be improved. Pessimism among the intelligentsia can also be a form of one-upmanship. A modern society is a league of political, industrial, financial, technological, military, and intellectual elites, all competing for prestige and influence, and with differing responsibilities for making the society run. Complaining about modern society can be a backhanded way of putting down one's rivals. For academics to feel superior to business people to feel superior to politicians, and so on. As Thomas Hobbes, oh my god, by the way, Brahmin Vaishya Kshatriya. As Thomas Hobbes noted in 1651, competition of praise inclineth to a reverence of antiquity. For men contend with the living, not with the dead. Pessimism, to be sure, has a bright side. The expanding circle of sympathy makes us concerned about harms that would have passed unnoticed in more callous times. Today, we recognize the Syrian civil war as a humanitarian tragedy. The wars of earlier decades, such as the Chinese Civil War, the partition of India, and the Korean War, are seldom remembered that way, though they killed and displaced more people. When I grew up, bullying was considered a natural part of boyhood. It would have strained belief to think that someday the President of the United States would deliver a speech about its evils, as Barack Obama did in 2011. As we care about more of humanity, we are apt to mistake the harms around us for signs of how low the world has sunk rather than how high our standards have risen. But relentless negativity can itself have unintended consequences, and recently, a few journalists have begun to point them out. In the wake of the 2016 American election, the New York Times writers David Bornstein and Tina Rosenberg reflected on the media's role in its shocking outcome. Quote, Trump was the beneficiary of a belief, near universal in American journalism, that serious news can essentially be defined as what's going wrong. For decades, journalism's steady focus on problems and seemingly incurable pathologies was preparing the soil that allowed Trump's seeds of discontent and despair to take root. One consequence is that many Americans today have difficulty imagining, valuing, or even believing in the promise of incremental system change, which leads to a greater appetite for revolutionary, smash-the-machine change. End quote. Bornstein and Rosenberg don't blame the usual culprits, cable TV, social media, late-night comedians, but instead trace it to the shift during the Vietnam and Watergate eras from glorifying leaders to checking their power, with an overshoot toward indiscriminate cynicism, in which everything about America's civic actors invites an aggressive takedown. If the roots of progressophobia lie in human nature, is my suggestion that it is on the rise itself an illusion of the availability bias? Anticipating the methods I will use in the rest of the book, let's look at the objective measure. The data scientist Kalev Litaru applied a technique called sentiment mining to every article published in the New York Times between 1945 and 2005, and to an archive of translated articles and broadcasts from 130 countries between 1979 and 2010. Sentiment mining assesses the emotional tone of a text by tallying the number and context of words with positive and negative connotations like good, nice, terrible, and horrific. Figure 4.1 shows the results. Wait, I'll show you the figure. No, let's just discuss the findings of this graph because the graph is not going to be very visible in the screen. Putting aside the wiggles and waves that reflect the crises of the day, we see that the impression that the news has become more negative over time is real. The New York Times got steadily more morose from the early 1960s to the early 1970s, lightened up a bit, just a bit in the 1980s because of Reagan's policies, in the 80s and 90s, and then sank into a progressively worse mood in the first decade of the new century because of 9/11, of course. News outlets in the rest of the world too became gloomier and gloomier from the late 70s to the present day because they copy American media. So has the world really gone steadily downhill from during these decades? This is the graph, by the way. Okay. This is positive happiness news coverage and then going down and down. Keep figure 4.1 in mind as we examine the state of humanity in the chapters to come. What is progress? You might think that the question is so subjective and culturally relative as to be forever unanswerable. In fact, it's one of the easier questions to answer. Most people agree that life is better than death, health is better than sickness, sustenance is better than hunger, abundance is better than poverty. Therefore, capitalism will never be as bad as socialism, no matter how much all sorts of nationalist socialists try to claim, because you would rather be a woke transgender uh, obese person who dies of heart attack at 42 than starve to death in a socialist country. Abundance is better than poverty, peace is better than war, safety is better than danger, freedom is better than tyranny. Equal rights are better than bigotry and discrimination. Literacy is better than illiteracy. Knowledge is better than ignorance. Intelligence is better than dull-wittedness. Happiness is better than misery. Opportunities to enjoy family, friends, culture, and nature are better than drudgery and monotony. All these things can be measured. If they have increased over time, that is progress. Granted, not everyone would agree on the exact list. The values are avowedly humanistic and leave out religious, romantic, and aristocratic virtues like salvation, grace, sacredness, heroism, honor, glory, and authenticity. But most would agree that it's a necessary start. It's easy to extol transcendent values in the abstract, but most people prioritize life, health, safety, literacy, sustenance, and stimulation for the obvious reason that these goods are a prerequisite to everything else. If you are reading this, you are not dead, starving, destitute, moribund, terrified, enslaved, or illiterate, which means that you are in no position to turn your nose up at these values or to deny that other people should share your good fortune. As it happens, the world does agree on these values. In the year 2000, all 189 members of the United Nations, together with 24 international organizations, agreed on 8 Millennium Development Goals for the year 2015 that blend right into this list. And here is a shocker. The world has made spectacular progress in every single measure of human well-being. Here is a second shocker. Almost no one knows about it. Information about human progress, though absent from major news outlets and intellectual forums, is easy enough to find. The data are not entombed in dry reports but are displayed in gorgeous websites, particularly Max Roser's Our World in Data, Marianne Tupy's Human Progress, and Hans Rosling's Gapminder. Rosling learned that not even swallowing a sword during a 2007 TED Talk was enough to get the world's attention. The case has been made in beautifully written books, some by Nobel laureates, which flaunt the news in their titles. Progress, The Progress Paradox, Infinite Progress, these are books by Nobel laureates, okay? The Infinite Resource, The Rational Optimist, The Case for Rational Optimism, Utopia for Realists, Mass Flourishing, Abundance, The Improving State of the World, Getting Better, The End of Doom, The Moral Arc, The Big Ratchet, The Great Escape, The Great Surge, The Great Convergence. None was recognized with a major prize, but over the period in which they appeared, Pulitzers in nonfiction were given out to, okay, so these are books not These are books whose authors didn't receive any big prize. Pulitzers in nonfiction were given to 4 books on genocide, 3 on terrorism, 2 on cancer, 2 on racism, and 1 on extinction. And for those whose reading habits tend toward listicles, recent years have offered 5 amazing pieces of good news nobody is reporting. 5 reasons why 2013 was the best year in human history. 7 reasons the world looks worse than it really is. 26 charts and maps that show the world is getting much, much better. 40 ways the world is getting better. And my favorite, 50 reasons we are living through the greatest period in world history. Let's look at some of those reasons. Chapter 5, Life. Oh, I'll take a small break. Life, guys. The struggle to stay alive is the primal urge of animate beings, and humans deploy their ingenuity and conscious resolve to starve off death as long as possible. Choose life so that you and your children may live, commanded the God of the Hebrew Bible. Rage, rage against the dying of the light, adjured Dylan Thomas. Interstellar. A long life is the ultimate blessing. How long do you think an average person in the world can be expected to live today? Bear in mind that the global average is dragged down by the premature deaths from hunger and disease in the populous countries in the developing world, particularly by the deaths of infants, who mix a lot of zeros into the average. The answer for 2015 is 71.4 years. How close is that to your guess? In a recent survey, Hans Rosling found that less than 1 in 4 Swedes guessed that it was that high, a finding consistent with the results of other multinational surveys of opinions on longevity, literacy, and poverty in what Rosling dubbed the Ignorance Project. The logo of the project is a chimpanzee because, as Rosling explained, quote, if for each question I wrote the alternatives on bananas and asked the chimpanzees in the zoo to pick the right answers, they would have done better than the respondents. End quote. The respondents, including students and professors of global health, were not so much ignorant as fallaciously pessimistic. Figure 5.1, a plot from Max Roser of life expectancy over the centuries, displays a general pattern in world history. At the time when the lines begin, in the mid 18th century, life expectancy in Europe and the Americas was around 35. 35, where it had been parked for the 225 previous years for which we have data. Okay? Mid 18th century. Life expectancy, और उसके बाद एक book लिखा गया in 1776, which allegedly led to divorces in 2025. Life expectancy for the world as a whole was 29. These numbers are in the range of expected lifespans for most of human history. The life expectancy of hunter-gatherers is around 32.5, and it probably decreased among the peoples who first took up farming because their starchy diet and the diseases they caught from their livestock and each other. It returned to the low 30s by the Bronze Age, where it stayed put for thousands of years, with small fluctuations across centuries and regions. This period in human history may be called the Malthusian era, when any advance in agriculture or health was quickly cancelled by the resulting bulge in population, though era is an odd term for 99.9% of our species' existence. The Malthusian era, okay? Population control karo. But starting in the 19th century, the world embarked on the Great Escape, the economist Angus Deaton's term for humanity's release from its patrimony of poverty, disease, and early death. Life expectancy began to rise, picked up speed in the 20th century, and shows no sign of slowing down. As the economic historian Johann Norberg points out, we tend to think that, quote, we approach death by 1 year for every year we age, but during the 20th century, the average person approached death by just 7 months for every year they aged. Thrillingly, the gift of longevity is spreading to all of humankind, including the world's poorest countries, and at a much faster pace than it did in the rich ones. Life expectancy in Kenya increased by almost 10 years between 2003 and 2013. Norberg writes, after having lived, loved, and struggled for a whole decade, the average person in Kenya had not lost a single year of their remaining lifetime. Everyone got 10 years older, yet death had not come a step closer. As a result, Inequality in life expectancy, which opened up during the Great Escape when a few fortunate countries broke away from the pack, is shrinking as the rest catch up. In 1800, no country in the world had a life expectancy above 40. By 1950, it had grown to be around 60 in Europe and the Americas, leaving Africa and Asia far behind. But since then, Asia has shot up at twice the European rate and Africa at 1.5 times the rate. An African born today can expect to live as long as a person born in the Americas in 1950s or in Europe in the 1930s. The average would have been longer still were it not for the calamity of AIDS, which caused the terrible trough in the 1990s when antiretroviral drugs started to bring it under control. The African AIDS dip is a reminder that progress is not an escalator that inexorably raises the well-being of every human being, human everywhere all the time. That would be magic. And progress is an outcome not of magic, but of problem solving. Problems are inevitable. And at times, particular sectors of humanity have suffered terrible setbacks, like the example Shayo gave. In addition to the African AIDS epidemic, longevity went into reverse for young adults worldwide during the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 through 1918 through 1919, and for middle-aged, non-college educated, non-Hispanic white Americans in the early 21st century. But problems are solvable, and the fact that longevity continues to increase in every other Western demographic means that solutions to the problems facing this one exist as well. Average lifespans are stretched the most by decreases in infant and child mortality, both because children are fragile and because the death of a child brings down the average more than the death of a 60-year-old. Figure 5.2 shows what has happened to child mortality since the age of Enlightenment in 5 countries that are more or less representative of their continents. Look at the numbers on the vertical axis. They refer to the percentage of children who die before reaching the age of 5. Yes, well into the 19th century in Sweden, one of the world's wealthiest countries, between a quarter and a third of all children died before their 5th birthday, well into the 19th century. And in some years, the death toll was close to half. This appears to be typical in human history. A fifth of hunter-gatherer children die in their first year and almost half before they reach adulthood. The spikiness in the curve before the 20th century reflects not just noise in the data, but the parlous nature of life. An epidemic, war, or famine could bring death to one's door at any time. Even the well-to-do could be struck by tragedy. Charles Darwin lost 2 children in infancy and his beloved daughter Annie at the age of 10, even Rabindranath Thakur's family members. Then a remarkable thing happened. The rate of child mortality plunged 100-fold to a fraction of a percentage point in developed countries, and the plunge went global. As Deaton observed in 2013, quote, "There is not a single country in the world where infant or child mortality today is not lower than it was in 1950, end quote. In sub-Saharan Africa, the child mortality rate has fallen from around 1 in 4 in the 1960s to less than 1 in 10 in 2015, and फिर भी blame करे colonialism को. And the global rate has fallen from 18 to 4%, still too high, but sure to come down if the current thrust to improve global health continues. Remember 2 facts behind the numbers. One is demographic. When fewer children die, parents have fewer children, since they no longer have to hedge their bets against losing their entire families. So contrary to the worry that saving children's lives would only set off a population bomb, a major eco-panic of the 1960s and 70s, which led to the calls for reducing healthcare in the developing world. They called for reducing healthcare in the developing world so that people in the rest of the world don't die of a population bomb. And we were being taught about population explosion all the time in our classrooms, remember? The decline in child mortality has diffused the population bomb explosion. The other is personal. The loss of a child is among the most devastating experiences. Imagine the tragedy, then try to imagine it another million times. That's a quarter of the number of children who did not die last year alone, who would have died had they been born 50 years earlier. Now repeat 200 times or so for the years since the decline in child mortality began. Graphs like figure 5.2 display a triumph of human well-being whose magnitude the mind cannot begin to comprehend. Just as difficult to appreciate is humanity's impending triumph over another of nature's cruelties, the death of a mother in childbirth. The God of the Hebrew Bible, ever merciful, told the first woman, I will multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. So he was being sarcastic. Until recently, about 1% of mothers died in the process. For an American woman, being pregnant a century ago was almost as dangerous as having breast cancer today. Figure 5.3 shows the trajectory of maternal mortality since 1751 in 4 countries that are representative of their regions. Starting in the late 18th century in Europe, the mortality rate plummeted 300-fold from 1.2 to 0.004%. The declines have spread to the rest of the world, including the poorest countries where the death rate has fallen even faster, though for a shorter time because of their later start. The rate for the entire world, after dropping almost in half in just 25 years, is now about 0.2%, around where Sweden was in 1941. You may be wondering whether the drops in child mortality explain all the gains in longevity shown in figure 5.1. Are we really living longer, or are we just surviving infancy in greater numbers? After all, the fact that people before the 19th century had an average life expectancy at birth of around 30 years doesn't mean that everyone dropped dead on their 30th birthday. The many children who died pulled the average down, cancelling the boost of the people who died of old age, and these seniors can be found in every society. In the time of the Bible, the days of our years were said to be 70, and that's the age at which Socrates' life was cut short in 399 BCE, not by natural causes but by a cup of hemlock. Most most hunter-gatherer tribes have plenty of people in their 70s and even some in their 80s. Though a Hadza woman's life expectancy at birth is 32.5 years, if she makes it to 45, she can expect to live another 21 years. So do those of us who survive the ordeals of childbirth and childhood today live any longer than the survivors of earlier eras? Yes, much longer. Figure 5.4 shows the life expectancy in the United Kingdom at birth and at different ages from 1 to 70 over the past 3 centuries. No matter how old you are, you have more years ahead of you than people of your age did in earlier decades and centuries. A British baby who had survived the hazardous first year of life would have lived to 47 in 1845, 57 in 1905, 72 in 1955, and 81 in 2011. A 30-year-old could look forward to another 33 years of life in 1845, another 36 in 1905, another 43 in 1955, another 52 in 2011. If Socrates had been acquitted in 1905, he could have expected to live another 9 years. In 1955, he could have expected to live another 10 years. In 2011, another 16. An 80-year-old in 1845 had more years of life. An 80-year-old in 2011 an 80-year-old in 1845 had 5 more years of life. An 80-year-old in 2011, 9 years. Similar trends, though with lower numbers so far, have occurred in every part of the world. For example, a 10-year-old Ethiopian in 1950 could expect to live to 44. A 10-year-old Ethiopian today can expect to live to 61. The economist Stephen Radelet has pointed out that the improvements in health among the global poor in the last few decades are so large and widespread that they rank among the greatest achievements in human history. But rising income inequality, guys, the poor are getting poorer, richer getting richer, and we are all dying of climate change. Rarely has the basic well-being of so many people around the world improved so substantially so quickly. Yet, few people are even aware that it is happening. And no, the extra years of life will not be spent senile in a rocking chair. Of course, the longer you live, the more of those years you live as an older person with its inevitable aches and pains. But bodies that are better at resisting a mortal blow are also better at resisting the lesser assaults of disease, injury, and wear. Hence, the modern trend of, at least in the West, of so many old people being fitter than 20-year-old, 30-year-old Indians. As the lifespan is stretched, our run of vigor is stretched out as well. Even if not by the same number of years. A heroic project called the Global Burden of Disease has tried to measure this improvement by tallying not just the number of people who drop dead of each of 291 diseases and disabilities, but how many years of healthy life they lose, weighted by the degree to which each condition compromises the quality of their lives. For the world in 1990, the project estimated that 56.8 of the 64.5 years of life that an average person could be expected to live were years of healthy life. And at least in developed countries, where estimates are available for 2010 as well, we know that out of the 4.7 years of additional expected life we gained in those 2 decades, 3.8 were healthy years. Numbers like these show that people today live far more years in the pink of health than their ancestors lived altogether, healthy and infirm years combined. For many people, the greatest fear raised by the prospect of a longer life is dementia. But another pleasant surprise has come to light. Between 2000 and 2012, the rate among Americans over 65 fell by a quarter, and the average age at diagnosis rose from 80.7 to 82.4 years. There is still more good news. The curves in figure 5.4 are not tapestries of your life that have been drawn out and measured by two of the fates and will someday be cut by the third. Rather, they are projections from today's vital statistics based on the assumption that medical knowledge will be frozen at its current state. It's not that anyone believes that assumption, but in the absence of clairvoyance and about future medical advances, we have no other choice. That means you will almost certainly live longer, perhaps much longer, than the numbers you read off the vertical axis. People will complain about anything, and in 2001, George W. Bush appointed a President's Council on Bioethics to deal with the looming threat of biomedical advances that promise longer and healthier lives. Its chairman, the physician and public intellectual Leon Cass, decreed that, quote, the desire to prolong youthfulness is an expression of a childish and narcissistic wish incompatible with a devotion to posterity, end quote, and that the years that would be added to other people's lives were not worth living. Would professional tennis players really enjoy playing 25% more games of tennis? He asks. Most people would rather decide that for themselves, and that even if he is right that quote unquote mortality makes life matter, longevity is not the same as immortality. But the fact that experts' assertions about maximum possible life expectancy have repeatedly been shattered, on average 5 years after they were published, raises the question of whether longevity will increase indefinitely and someday slip the surly bonds of mortality entirely. Should we worry about a world of stodgy multicentenarians who will resist the innovations of a 90-something upstarts and perhaps ban the begetting of pesky children altogether? A number of Silicon Valley visionaries are trying to bring that world closer. They have funded research institutes which aim not to chip away at mortality one disease at a time, but to reverse engineer the aging process itself and upgrade our cellular hardware to a version without the bug. The result, they hope, will be an increase in the human lifespan of 50, 100, even 1,000 years. In his 2005 bestseller, The Singularity is Near, the book is called The Singularity is Near, the inventor Ray Kurzweil forecasts that those of us who make it to 2045 will live forever. Holy shit. Thanks to advances in genetics, nanotechnology, such as nanobots that will course through our bloodstream and repair our bodies from the inside, and artificial intelligence, which will not just figure out how to do all this, but recursively improve its own intelligence without limit. To readers of medical newsletters and other hypochondriacs, the prospects for immortality look rather different. We certainly find incremental improvements to celebrate, such as a decline in the death rate from cancer over the past 25 years of around a percentage point a year, saving 1 million lives in the United States alone. But we also are regularly disappointed by miracle drugs that work no better than the placebo, treatments with side effects worse than the disease, and trumpeted benefits that wash out in the meta-analysis. Medical progress today is more Sisyphus than singularity. Lacking the gift of prophecy, no one can say whether scientists will ever find a cure for mortality. But evolution and entropy make it unlikely. Senescence is baked into our genome at every level of organization because natural selection favors genes that make us vigorous when we are young over those that make us live as long as possible. That bias is built in because of the asymmetry of time. There is a non-zero probability at any moment that we will be felled by an unpreventable accident like a lightning strike or landslide, making the advantage of any costly longevity gene moot. Biologists would have to reprogram thousands of genes or molecular pathways, each with a small and uncertain effect on longevity, to launch the leap to immortality. And even if we were fitted with perfectly tuned biological hardware, the march of entropy would degrade it. As the physicist Peter Hoffman points out, life pits biology against physics in mortal combat. Violently thrashing molecules constantly collide with the machinery of our cells, including the very machinery that starves off entropy by correcting errors and repairing damage. As damage to the various damage control systems accumulates, the risk of collapse increases exponentially, sooner or later swamping whatever protections biomedical science has given us against constant risks like cancer and organ failure. In my view, the best projection of the outcome of our multi-century war on death is Stein's law, which is things that can't go on forever don't, as amended by Davies's corollary, quote, things that can't go on forever can go on much longer than you think, end quote. Next chapter is health. क्या सब बोल रहा है editor वहाँ पे? No, this was a lot of food for thought. I'll keep the live stream short even for this one. Wow, we read about 30 pages. कहाँ से शुरू किया? कहाँ से खत्म हो जा रहा है बुक? बहुत बहुत इजी रीडिंग है बुक का. 40th पेज से शुरू किया. अभी 61 तक पहुंच गया. कितना जल्दी? But this wasn't deep stuff. This was just food for thought. पिछले दिनों और थोड़ा food for thought हुआ था. I'll check some comments and go off like soon. No, short live stream only because of today, because I'm very tired. I didn't sleep much before going to the High Court. That's why. What happened to Shayok? Oh, ACL tear, no? Yeah. What a bitch. I think Steven Pinker is not good for current India because it will make us complacent. I disagree. Two things away. One is Pinker is not talking about any particular country. He's talking about the world in general, where he is right. So acknowledging what is right and true should not ever be a deterrent for the country or for anybody, even on an individual level. Secondly, this sort of view can even directly benefit India, because we will then move away from the alarmist positions like, yes, kal China khatam, परसों इंडिया सुपर पावर, या फिर पॉपुलेशन एक्सप्लोजन की वजह से हमारा देश का क्या हाल है देखो, इफ ओनली बिहारीज एंड यूपीआइट्स वोर मोर कॉन्डम्स, इंडिया वुड बी सो मच बेटर ऑफ. All that kinds of idiocy would get countered. Yes, only wealth generation solves poverty, and not just poverty. Wealth generation solves environmental problems as well. If you make as many people as possible as rich as possible as quickly as possible, then they will all care about the environment. The point is, most of the Indians will not understand that. As if we really give a fuck about what most Indians will understand. It's not like we are देखो हमको पढ़ाया नहीं गया स्टीवन पिंकर, अब हर किसी के लिए मैंडेटेड स्टीवन पिंकर. वो तो हम बोल नहीं रहे, ये तो हम लोगों के लिए है, ये हमारे एक्सक्लूसिव ग्रुप में कंजम्पशन पैटर्न है. Okay then, thanks for joining guys. See you tomorrow. Bye bye. Good night.
যদি সবাই ফিরে যায়, ওরে ওরে ও ভাগা সবাই ফিরে যায়, যদি গহন পথে যাওয়ার কালে কেউ ফিরে না যায়, তবে পথের কাটা তুই রক্ত মাখা চরণ তলে একলা দলরে, তুই রক্ত মাখা চরণ তলে একলা দলরে, যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে তবে একলা চলো রে. যদি আলো না ধরে ওরে ওরে ও ভাগা চলো রে, আপন বুকের পাঁজর চালিয়ে নিয়ে একলা চলো রে। যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে, তবে একলা চলো রে। একলা চলো, একলা চলো, একলা চলো।